everyone, welcome back to another episode of Makeup and Wake Up. I am so thankful that you've decided to return for another episode. Hopefully up until this point you have been keeping up with the series. If you happen to miss any of the previous episodes, especially the episode from 2 weeks ago about racism in healthcare, and especially the first few episodes mainly about the 13th Amendment, abolishing prisons, and abolishing the police, are going to be very important for understanding the topic of this week's episode, which is mental health. So I usually like to start out these episodes with a little bit of history. So in America, scientific racism was definitely used to justify slavery. The idea that black people were inferior to white people was all used to justify slavery and keep enslaved people. Obviously, because if a white man can justify that his enslaved people are not as smart as he is, they don't have the same conscious thoughts that he does, that they don't have the same feelings or mental capacity that the white man does, obviously they are going to use that to their advantage and justify having slaves and also maintaining that abusive relationship towards slaves. Benjamin Rush is often referred to as the father of psychiatry, and he also signed the Declaration of Independence. Problematically though, people do also refer to him as believing in the abolishment of slavery, and that's really problematic because he had a lot of racism towards black people. He definitely believed that black people were not equal to white people, stating that black people suffered from something called negritude, and saying that the way to cure that is for black people to become more white. So although he might have wanted to abolish slavery, he also wanted to abolish blackness. He also didn't feel that black people were equal to white people unless the black people adopted more white characteristic traits. And then in 1851, another American physician named Samuel Cartwright, he actually published a work stating that slaves who wanted freedom were mentally ill. But Samuel stated in his research that when slaves wanted freedom, that was a result of their masters treating them with a little bit more respect. And the way to treat this mental illness was to whip the devil out of them, and he also suggested that masters treat their enslaved people like children to maintain a submissive and dominant relationship with them. So this scientific racism towards black people very early on in American history definitely shows us that there was motive to control the black population. Obviously, because America since the beginning and still now has shown us that they cannot sustain their economy without the exploitation of black and brown bodies. And because institutions like healthcare and mental health has such a racist history, it does lead healthcare professionals to have implicit bias, to have ingrained racism within their way of communicating and practicing and treatments. Throughout the years, scientific racism has led healthcare professionals to view black and brown bodies as less than white bodies, and has led to exploitation and experimentation on these people of color. So prior to the civil rights movement, schizophrenia was sort of viewed as a middle-class housewife's illness, which definitely is problematic in itself when you think about the exploitation of women and women's health and women's mental health. But the idea of the type of person that was schizophrenic changed in the 1960s by the scientific community. The scientific community started describing schizophrenia as violent and a social disease, and they started describing schizophrenia as a disorder of the biological brain function. Research articles started saying that the disorder manifested through rage and aggression, and that it was a condition that afflicted black men. This is especially concerning when you remember that the 1960s was at the peak of the civil rights movement. So connecting anger with schizophrenia only devalued the civil rights movement and their protesters. So because of scientific racism and these research articles coming out about schizophrenia being manifested through anger and violence and it being depicted as a black man's illness. In the 1960s and the 1970s, there definitely was a switch in advertisement and media. An example of this is that there was an ad for an antipsychotic, and to advertise for this product, product. The company used a black man whose fists were clenched together, and it was set in an urban scene, and it had the headline "Assertive and Belligerent" with a question mark, advertising that this antipsychotic was meant for angry black men and that it will help tame their behavior. Meanwhile, in mainstream white media, schizophrenia was being described as a condition of angry black masculinity. Mainstream white media also exploited black men by making people believe that crazed black schizophrenic killers were constantly on the loose and it was something that you needed to be afraid of. Through media and scientific racism, the black psyche was increasingly being portrayed as unwell, immortal, and inherently criminal. And those ideas and feelings towards black people only justified police brutality all throughout the civil rights movement, Jim Crow laws, and mass incarceration. Racial and socioeconomic disparities are very well documented within mental health care, and research of these disparities reveal that people of color are less likely to have access to mental health care, less likely to seek out mental health services, less likely to receive necessary care, more likely to receive poor quality of care, and more likely to be misdiagnosed. The concerns of this research is especially alarming when you think about the fact that mental health care is oftentimes most likely provided in prisons, and this infers a multitude of issues. In our criminal system, black people are overly incarcerated, and statistics show that over 50% of people that are incarcerated suffer from some sort of mental health disorder. This suggests that in America, our way of dealing with mental health, especially in people of color communities, is to throw them in prisons. This results in the inability for people to have access to proper health care and results in people being scared to even seek out treatment. In jails and prisons, the standard for mental health care is very low, and oftentimes treatments can be very traumatic. So let's talk about mental health care providers and what we have in America. The vast majority of mental health care providers are white. 86% of our psychologists are white, and less than 2% of the American Psychological Association is black. And research has demonstrated that provider bias and stereotyping are relevant factors in health disparities. Biases in mental health providers can be a result of having different cultural perceptions of a person. A mental health care provider could believe something about someone's culture just by looking at them and decide what help-seeking behaviors could look like in a culture. And that can be really dangerous because that does plague someone's ability to really see a person for who they are. Biases can also create access barriers and communication barriers, along with fear and mistrust of treatment between the care provider and the patient. Other very worth mentioning facts is that Black Americans are most likely to be involuntarily admitted into psychiatric institutions, and usually law enforcement does have their hands in that. This especially affects homelessness. Also, people with mental illness are oftentimes not even violent. However, because police brutality and the violent culture that police maintain in America, police being involved in most of the mental illness cases in communities of color oftentimes create the stigma that mental illness and violence go hand in hand. Americans with mental illness are 16 times more likely to be shot and killed by the police in America, and Black Americans with mental illness are in the highest risk group for having fatal encounters with police. I'm going to leave some resources down below from the Black Mental Health Matters website. These resources include hotlines and health crisis hotlines, along with many foundations that are offering help and also ways to get involved. Much like pretty much every single institution in America, when we look at the historic and systematic context of mental health, we can absolutely see why racial disparities still happen today. We really need to understand and recognize and not ignore the past of our country in order to address current issues and barriers. When we can so clearly see that scientific racism in the very beginning of American history was meant to maintain slavery, justify slavery, and maintain the very abusive relationship between a master and its enslaved person. We can see that schizophrenia was used to weaponize Black male masculinity and portray these characteristics as threatening and scary and as a result of mental illness. The history and ingrained racism in our mental health system and many other institutions are clearly why racism and racist disparities today still exist. I usually don't add my own personal opinions to these videos, but I really want to take a moment and tie everything that we've been learning together through the series together in this one episode. America's economy has never been able to sustain itself without free labor or the exploitation of workers. To maintain free labor and exploitation, America has always tried to find ways to justify it. Scientific racism from the very beginning justified slavery, justified the abusive relationship between a master and its enslaved person. America couldn't continue justifying slavery, obviously, after it was abolished, so instead they created the 13th Amendment, which allowed slavery to continue, but under the ideas that it was being done by criminals and they deserved to be working the way that they are and working in the conditions that they do because they are criminals and they were dangerous to the society. And because America's economy cannot be successful without free labor, obviously minority groups became a target and their communities became very heavily policed. And this was justified because people were made to believe that these communities suffered from more mental illness. And instead of people of color being able to treat their mental illness with medication or treatments, people of color are thrown in jail for it. This is how America deals with mental illness. They make it up, and then they jail black and brown bodies for it, and then they profit off of it. Having the overwhelming majority of mental health providers being white is extremely problematic. Implicit bias is inevitable in situations where one race dominates, and in institutions with so much ingrained racism, this is extremely damaging and even leads to death of people of color. Like I've said in past videos, if you are not at the table, you are on the menu, and black and brown people must be represented in every single institution in America, including healthcare and mental health care. America really loves to ignore the fact that its past is so racist and that almost every, I would even argue every institution in America was founded on racist values. They just love to ignore that shit, but ignoring it can never bring change. We have to recognize that the past of these institutions and the foundation of these institutions were inherently racist, because if we don't, the cycle keeps continuing. The practices that were founded on racist ideas will continue to happen. The damage of the racist past of America has caused so much damage to people of color, and it leads to jail and death. This is undeniable and we cannot ignore it. We have to acknowledge the fact that the institutions in America were founded on racist ideas, and those ideas are still very prevalent in today's practices. Everything that we've talked about between this episode and every other episode is crucial for seeing the bigger picture. Let's turn prisons into hospitals and housings and schools. Let's defund the police and reallocate that money into jobs and education and healthcare. The future of America depends on it, and we are desperate for change. That is it for today's episode on racism in mental health and scientific racism. I hope that you enjoyed this episode and I hope that you got something out of it. If you haven't already watched the other episodes in the series, I highly recommend that you do go back and watch them. And in the description of all of those videos is additional resources and videos and articles that you can read up on the subjects. Make sure you are subscribed and have your notifications on for when I post the next episode of Makeup and Wake Up, and I will see you in 2 weeks.